Welcome to Rewiring the American Edge, the podcast where we explore the intersection of innovation, automation, and policy to ask, what will it take for cities, industries, and people to thrive in a rapidly changing world? I'm Billy Riggs, urban planner, professor, entrepreneur, and technologist, and with my co-host Vepil Vyas, we explore how to build more competitive, inclusive, and resilient economies around the world. Join us.
Vipul, go on.
Good. How are you?
Okay. Yeah, surviving. Well, this is episode 2 of Rewiring the American Dream. And if you recall, last time we spent a lot of time kind of defining what we meant by the idea of rewiring. And just to refresh folks, that concept was really just kind of rethinking and resetting this idea and kind of starting at zero from a strategy standpoint. And I think, Vip, we came up with some lessons, but I think they were kind of management 101 lessons at the end. Do you want to kind of refresh everyone in terms of kind of what our management 101 lessons were at the end of our last episode?
Let's just have a goal.
Yeah.
And, it reminds me, there's a Dean Preston, who was a former supervisor on the board of supervisors in San Francisco, part of the city council, basically, and was not reelected, and had a post today, or maybe it was yesterday, recently, that essentially said that the police in the city, who he was never very aligned with, were taking sick time and using that sick time to go work private security jobs. And as a result, they were booking lots of overtime for the people who were covering for them. And then obviously they were increasing their salary because they're still getting paid, most likely for the sick days, etc. And so it was a rant basically about how the police are bad. And the reason this sort of circles back to what we're talking about having a goal is it's a rant. It's a rant against the police, which are political opponents of his. And he wants, after being in office, a jab at him, I would assume, or something. I don't know. But the thing is that it could be a very legitimate point. Like, look, this level of, if you want to call it, corruption or fraud is happening. This is taking place. And a city audit has revealed this. But if you don't have a guiding North Star or a goal to say, well, look, our goal is to make streets safer. And we want to do that by making sure that the X millions of dollars that we spend on the police force is used wisely to achieve that goal. And therefore, my policy prescription is to say that negotiate with the union and say, look, if you're caught doing this, it's grounds for automatic termination, something like that. Or if you get caught doing this twice. Now, I don't think you can do that because that means it involves holding public sector unions accountable. You may even introduce performance-based pay, all kinds of things that on the other side of the equation, where he is allied with labor, it's going to be a problem. So his North Star is to essentially damage, ridicule, humiliate, what do you want to call it, a political foe as represented by the police department. Civic goal doesn't exist, from what I can tell, or it's not clear. And the civic goal, you would hope, is the safer streets and the best use of limited resources to achieve that goal in the most impactful way possible. But that's not articulated.
Yeah.
And the absence of that points to the absence of a goal, and the absence of that goal points to an absence of intent, which is the clear problem. So that's the Management 101 lesson I think I'd take away from all that. Now, not taking anything away from his potential argument or his findings, but the fact that they don't lead to a suggested remedy that's very concrete and specific is the issue.
Yeah, well, and thanks, Dean, for your service. I just realized, Dean, that I played city sessions with you way back in the day at Club Wazima, so thank you for that, too. City sessions was awesome. So Dean did a lot of great things for the Visadero corridor and the local music scene way back in the day. I actually forgot about that. That I played music with Dean because he did a whole music thing early on.
Good.
with City Sessions, which was this whole acoustic music thing that happened in an Ethiopian restaurant on Divisadero early in the day. No, I think also with this idea of reset, or this idea of rewiring, and this idea of tech automation and kind of having a strategy. And we got to give shout out to Matt Mahan here in the Bay Area with City of San Jose, who's one of these dynamic new young mayors in the US that's really kind of using strategy, but it's also not a scrape clean. I mean, I think what we're seeing now is like harnessing the best of policy and the best ideas, but also ideas that aren't that aren't new. It's drawing ideas that are grounded in past theory. That we can draw on the ideas of Locke and Jefferson and the great thinkers of the past. And Vipul, I know that you are passionate about the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers and the great thinkers of the past. And I know that your son sings Hamilton songs all the time. But we remember that the kind of the values of the founding fathers and the values of democracy and kind of that are I think espoused in the Constitution, with which I believe our elected officials do pledge to uphold and are sworn to uphold, are really important. And I think a lot of what I think we should ground ourselves to in terms of leadership and what we kind of are ascribing to in this idea of rewiring is basing those policies on this grounding these ideas in norms related to ideas that are already based on kind of things that we know already work too. And sometimes I think like everything new under the sun we kind of already know. We know what works, so let's not reinvent the wheel.
Well, we definitely know a lot about human nature. Maybe not everything, but quite a bit, just through thousands of years of observation and experimentation with what motivates people. I think that tension you described, the Jeffersonian, Hamiltonian tension in the US is long persisting, which is basically a tension between decentralization and centralization of both authority and resources and action. And so when it comes to San Jose, and you mentioned Matt Mahan, I think a few things he's doing. He's embracing technology, and actually he's from a GovTech perspective, which is great. He's also implemented realistic strategies around homelessness and basically said, look, if you refuse treatment, then your options aren't to continue to live on the street, because there are negative implications to that for the individual and for broader society. And so he's just being realistic. And I think he may be perceived to be radical in that regard, but in truth, most of the European cities that have solved or been good at dealing with homelessness have generally done the things that he's suggesting we do. So he's actually, as you said, he's not being radically cutting edge and trying and doing something completely avant-garde. He's actually implementing strategies that have been tried elsewhere and generally have worked, which is, your options are you can get treatment, get help, get social housing or some form of it with the treatment, or you can't stay here. But living on the street is no longer a viable option, because it probably never really was. It's a slow form of, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, it's a slow form of suicide.
Yeah, and if we recall, since we're doing this as kind of additional content for our autonomous vehicles in the city initiative and related to our automation and innovation initiative, Matt was one of the keynote speakers in our 2018 autonomous vehicles in the city symposium. So when he was CEO of Brigade, so it's kind of cool full circle kind of citation that Matt is now mayor of San Jose. So. But I think that leads us to, full circle to Vipul. You and I are now doing this crazy Rewiring the Edge podcast, and we're talking about automation. And now it's not just about machines. It's about people. And that's really was our focus. Wanted to be our focus today. So let's dive in. Automation is not just about machines. Automation and innovation
Well, when people talk about automation today, they think about it in a few different contexts. One of which is, artificial intelligence, obviously, and the fact and the fear that people have that, or let's say it's the fear more than the fact, because we don't know, of AI automating away any number of jobs now and potentially all jobs over time. Right? That's a fear. The alternative view is look that around the turn of the century, 40 odd percent of jobs were agricultural jobs, and today it's about 2%. And it steadily dropped over the past century, and people found other things to do. And there's an argument that we will find something else to do, even though AI is doing all these other wonderful things, and that AI could theoretically be, smarter than us, and that scares people because it's not the smartest, as we have seen. The smartest of the species on the planet tend to dominate the others. So we'll have to see how that works out, but more tactically and practically in the short term, as you have some job displacement, as in there will be, and it's a matter of, will the rate of job displacement from AI exceed the rate at which we find new things to do and new ways to organize society and our political institutions adapt to these realities? And my suspicion is they won't, none of that will happen fast enough. And then people will think about things like universal basic income. How do we essentially, or other welfare models, how do we effectively keep people relatively whole given this disruption? And can we reskill people? Can we reorient and redirect them to other things that we are now understanding are going to be more valuable in this age? There's that, of course, but there's also just another simple thing that I think occurs in terms of, let's just talk about universal basic income. The idea of that society becomes super productive because these machines are super productive. And as a whole, we have more output, more productive output, both physical in terms of goods and services. And so society as a whole is richer because more things are able to happen. Now, that wealth could get aggregated at the top, and the people who control those means of production, to draw on some Marxist thought, create sort of a stranglehold on this development. And then that just worsens everything we have today in terms of wealth inequality, etc. So one way to create universal benefit, if not universal income, is to create infrastructure. And so the path to doing that is to say we have to consciously now, if we see that this AI revolution is coming, this is going to happen, we need to invest in our infrastructure, our services, our civic capacity that everyone can take advantage of. The one that we all take advantage of today are roads, the ability to be able to get around and go from one place to another. You do have to have a car, but the capacity to do so is much better than it was, 100 years ago. To go up and down the peninsula in the San Francisco Bay Area was by private railroads or probably an all-day trip on a pretty uncomfortable road. Now, that's all obviated by the fact that you have all this infrastructure, this civic, municipal, and county, state, federal infrastructure that's been created. And that's one of the easiest and best ways to create universal benefit. And so we have to get a lot more serious about that. And that is benefit in the terms of, if I was going to say again, I think last time I may have rattled these off, if I was king for a day, the several areas I'd focus on are going to be energy, transportation infrastructure and infrastructure in general, education, healthcare, and education. And those five, and maybe a couple other, the other one I'd probably throw in there would be safety. So if you do those handful of things really, really well, you become competitively attractive, but you also are focused on the things that make it easier to do business as well, and just to live. And I think that's where the whole point around the North Star is, if you have a clear definition of where you want to go in terms of those several dimensions, you'll be able to move the needle ideally. I'll close on this thought by saying, if you look at how Mayor Lurie in San Francisco has organized his departments, it's roughly along those lines. He said, these are the big things I want to move the needle on. So he's kind of clustered things in those rough groupings. There's a few things he's omitted, but like around energy and other things, but roughly that's an approach he's taking.
Interesting. Well, I think I think also when we think about these areas that you've identified, they really map well to this idea of reskilling and empowering future workers as well. And also the sectors that potentially open up opportunities in the future. And I'm wondering too, if kind of how these fit within your vision of what we need to think about in the future of onshoring. And I think you've thought a lot about this topic when we think about onshoring jobs. And how should we be thinking about defining the word onshoring in the context of what's happening politically right now with tariffs and with this idea that right now we see global contraction from an economic standpoint, when I from an economist standpoint am definitely a globalist and more of a free trade economist, and am a borderless economist. And I'm a little conflicted with the way I see the trends these days. But how are you seeing this trend of onshoring parallel the reality at current?
I think the tariff thing, ultimately everyone is trying to get to zero tariffs. The tariffs, I assume, I hope, are a negotiation tactic to get to the point where you do get essentially relatively reciprocal trade in terms of, and that we've actually or historically had that anyway, but you actually reduce even existing trade barriers. So that would be the ideal outcome, is that this is a temporary tool used to get there. Probably a very blunt instrument, usually done behind closed doors, not so much in public this way. I don't know if that works better. We'll have to see. It's a tactic that's, I could at least say it's novel, the way it's being executed. Whether it will work or not, I think like I said, we'll have to wait and see. But I think the ultimate goal, let me just say that the ultimate goal, I suspect, is to get to freer trade, actually, versus a mercantilistic system with everyone having their own little worlds. But to answer your question, I think what will happen is there's also a desire to become much more self-reliant, and the U.S. has done that, for example, in the space of energy. We now one of the biggest oil producers in the world, for good or bad. So we don't depend on anyone in that regard, unlike before, where that was a serious constraint. When it comes to basic energy and food, agricultural output, though I think we are maybe a net importer now. We generally can feed ourselves, and we provide ourselves our own energy, unlike in the past. So I think there's a recalibration to do more things of that nature, like that. And so one thing that's happened, or is happening, I think, is that U.S. businesses saw, and businesses in general saw, that it was just cheaper to make things in China, as an example, as just one reference point. And so get cost out of your business by just producing stuff there. I think one of the things that people forgot about is that, and it's fascinating because Apple has this approach of being really connected from a vertical integration perspective, from design to manufacturing, and really owning that whole stack. I think one of the things we're learning is that when you do this overseas in this way, you are basically giving all your expertise to somebody else. If you look at Roomba, for example, all that expertise is gone to folks overseas, and they just now make that thing better. Because they can. They own the manufacturing process. They can look at go down the factory floor. They can see, maybe to make this change. Let's prototype this very quickly. They can make that happen all very fast and do that in a way that they're constantly iterating, which is much harder to do for someone who's just designing, here from the US. And that decoupling, actually, the classic thing that I saw happen recently, and I'll close with this, and my perspective is, as the tariffs got ratcheted up, there was these Instagram memes of a gentleman in China showing these Hermes bags, these designer purses and handbags, and saying, look, this is something that Hermes charges $38,000 for, but I can make it for $1,400. So Hermes is screwing you, et cetera, et cetera. And what I don't think he was completely conscious of was the fact that basically he's going, I am okay stealing your intellectual property. In fact, that's just part of the game. And you as the consumer should just cut out the, brand name, just come to me, I'll get you the same stuff, the same quality for much cheaper. But in that argument, what everyone was missing is, I know how to, all the stuff he described, all the stitching, the leather, all the things that Hermes had sort of figured out and said, we know it now too. We know the best kind of hardware to use, the best kind of leather to use, the way to stitch this stuff. We've now absorbed all that. We can just do it. Now Hermes does not. Now it's not true that Hermes makes their stuff there actually, but the point is that if that were, all that knowledge is now in the possession of someone else aside from that company, and they can just reproduce it. And I think what's happening now is people are figuring that out.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for me, the idea of transaction fees or tariffs on products really just raise prices for consumers. It's horrible. I mean, it's horrible from the consumer standpoint. What it does, interestingly, is it promotes degrowth, which ironically is a sustainability lever. So thank you, Donald Trump and the Trump administration, for supporting carbon neutrality. So because you're supporting less consumption, and as much as we should, I think we will all be, there'll be a lot of Grinch memes at Christmas time because Donald Trump will have stolen Christmas from a lot of kids because there will be a lot less toys around the Christmas tree for a lot of kids because Mattel will have vacant shelves. But aside from that little sidebar, I think Vipple's, your kind of illustration on the vertical stack is really important from an automation and job standpoint, because this idea that the future workforce in the automation and innovation space, it super diffuse and complicated, and this idea of vertical integration I think is fragmenting, and this idea that you will have the master OEM or the master kind of software developer that is kind of the one ring to rule them all, that controls and vertically integrates everything, I think is a thing of the past. And I think what we are seeing is definitely a trend to have not less and less vertical integrated and more distributed stack, distributed not only workforce but also different hybridization of companies and distributed workforce, distributed teams, different types of customer, like different types of companies serving in different locations with different educational types. And even if we took, for example, the company Waymo as compared to the company Cruise as two different types of automation companies, this is kind of one of my bread and butter automation lectures. We saw Cruise as being a very tightly vertically integrated company akin to the traditional auto manufacturer. And, Cruise did everything from their engineering to their customer support all in-house. Everything from their software stack all the way down to their vehicle retriever was all done within the company. Yes, GM was an investor, but everything happened within the ecosystem. Now, Waymo is much different. They source their vehicles from Ford, Jaguar. They had a partnership. They now have a partnership with Toyota, Hyundai, and Zeekr, which is actually Chinese owned. So it's fairly convoluted from a hardware standpoint. They have Google Alphabet software. They actually have a partnership with a French company from a operations and a customer relations standpoint. They are actually handing over a lot of the B business to consumer side to Uber and Lyft. I actually suspect that, and I have recommended that they potentially let go of a lot of that B2C stuff long term, because I think there's a lot of profit to be made by letting go of that B2C stuff long term. B2C stuff is there's a lot of cost there, and it's a lot of that's trench warfare. I always tell my students that's a lot of high cost and potentially low margin from a revenue standpoint. So it's the same thing.
Yeah, sorry, I was saying that being decentralized or less vertically integrated is not a bad thing, and it's easier to do these days, and that's why it was done. But you should be vertically integrated where laws will protect things that are yours. And if you want to vertically integrate, then be aware that the things you develop and create may not stay yours for very long. And it's fine to outsource many things. That's perfectly reasonable and desirable in many cases. Let people focus on what they're good at. But they may be good at taking your stuff and making it for themselves. I mean, Foxconn makes Huawei phones now, right? And I'm sure some of the expertise they developed from making iPhones was an easy transition for them. So there are implications, and just I think people have to understand that.
So when we think about this idea of kind of moving to new kinds of jobs and kind of different types of distributed stacks, what do we need to think about when it comes to kind of new job centers, new jobs, and kind of like this idea of like new locations? Because one of the things that you and I uncovered like last year was that like we didn't know how to build boats, for example, in the US at this point, and we were basically buying our warships offshore.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what we talked about before, we don't make a lot of things that we need here and can't and don't have a path to get there. When you talk about ships really is, I think other people have described it this way. Building a ship is a matter of taking lots of plates of steel and putting them together. That's mostly what it is. Putting together lots of big plates of steel. And we don't have the capacity, capability, and really expertise any longer to do that at any level scale. Our shipbuilding capacity relative to, say, China is 1/35th the size. I think maybe even worse, I think it's they can build 350 ships in the time it takes us to build one. I think it's actually a factor of 10 worse. So what does that mean? It means for the things that we need, we are wholly dependent on others. And if I was going to characterize what we've done to ourselves, it's sort of self-colonization. Colonies typically provide raw materials to the colonizer to create manufactured goods to then sell back to the colonized entity. And that's been the colonial model for a long time, and it was enriching for the colonizer. And that's not with any value judgment. That's just what the mercantile model, that's how it worked. And people did it because it did work. But essentially what we've done to ourselves is have the top echelon of the country essentially play that role in moving that capacity overseas. So now you have lumber and cardboard and paper leave the port of SeaTac, Seattle, and for the Far East and come back with iPhones. Now, just based on that real example, that metaphor, what does that tell you about who owns who in a way? And so, getting back to your point around shipbuilding, this is one step of the things that we need to do here that people aren't thinking about strategically. So municipal leaders say, look, this has been something that the Navy, the Department of Defense, et cetera, have all been talking about on multiple levels, both for commercial shipping and also certainly military naval vessels, and no one is rushing forward to do something about it. Now, that's not totally true. Philadelphia did. The governor of Pennsylvania, the mayor of Philadelphia, all made an effort. They got a South Korean firm to set up shop there. But again, no one is thinking about that. Right now, we're more worried about just getting poop off the street as opposed to these bigger strategic questions of we have a workforce, there are needs out there in the market. How do we align what we can do with what's needed? And of course, San Francisco, the Bay Area was where you had the Liberty ships in World War II, where we're putting out one Liberty ship every 17 days. So that capacity that theoretically and probably deteriorated significantly, but that is in the DNA of the area, but not taken advantage of.
Yeah, I think this is a problem. I mean, I think you look at like what France is trying to do, for example, with revitalizing Dunkirk, and what we're trying to do with Mare Island in the San Francisco Bay Area, what the Port of LA is trying to do in San Pedro. It's a lot of it boils down to cities and kind of job centers and urban planning and kind of how you think about the way you think about job centers and economic development. And I mean, at the end of the day, planning a new city and planning economic revitalization is not easy. It's gotten harder because you have less tools in your quiver. You have less tools to recruit businesses. It's harder and harder to onshore businesses with less and less tax incentives given kind of global tax havens and less tools to prohibit companies from going to countries with tax havens and no consensus on prohibiting countries with basically zero corporate taxes. There's no global consensus on countries with zero corporate taxes. That's a big kind of global taboo right now where there's not consensus. And I think, we had some consensus where Janet Yellen had actually agreed to some stuff early in the Biden administration, but there was not that. So I think there's a lot that we could talk about that. I think in some future episodes, I definitely want to get into the urban planning and talk about some new cities. I want to bring in this crazy new VC city, California Forward. Those of you, if you're not from the Bay Area.
That's still happening?
There's a proposal to build a new greenfield city for 500,000 people in California, in the eastern part of the San Francisco Bay Area, called California Forever. Very interesting concept, and it is, it's still on the table. It's in eastern Solano County, worth talking about within the context of urban planning. But we're going to stick on this idea of jobs and the future of kind of how we reskill and think about the future of work for a little while. We got couple people we want to talk to. Someone from the Chamber of Commerce about kind of the future of jobs in the kind of the workforce. I think Vipul wants to talk to one of our friends from the city, from Oakland, and want to talk to some folks about the future of eGov and how we can be smarter in terms of how we govern over the next few episodes. But as we think about kind of automation and jobs and reskilling in the workforce, Vipul, final words, jobs, and kind of the labor equation for today.
There is so much happening that can disrupt and cause displacement and disruption that it needs to be a focus of leaders in the country. You got both the change in the sort of the trade structure or trade order in the world globally. That's one thing. And then you have these massive technology advancements. And so both of those things are going to be an issue.
Yeah.
And I think that people aren't focused on it so much.
Yeah, and I would say the same. I would add to that is that people always forget, with every automated function, human intervention is still required. The human factor is still a requirement. When a vehicle shuts down, when there is a disengagement and a brake caliper goes out of whack, when a vehicle needs to be cleaned, when when there's a flat tire, when somebody graffitis the backside of a car, it has to be clean. There's a lot of human intervention that still is a requirement in now and in the future of, I think, of what we're going to experience.
I mean, I think the ultimately machines probably can't be accountable. They can't own it.
There we go. Machines can't be accountable. That may be the solution to the labor equation.
Yep. Cool.
Thanks, Vipul. Have a good rest of your day, and thank you all for hanging with us, and we'll see you next time.
This has been Rewiring the American Edge, global conversations on innovation, automation, and the future of competitive cities. I'm Billy Riggs. Thanks for joining us. Our series is sponsored by the University of San Francisco Automation and Innovation Fund. If you're interested in supporting our students or work, reach out via email. Also, please connect with us on social media and LinkedIn. We would love to hear from you. Until then, all the best.